The first thing you notice is the heat, not warmth, thick, smoky, almost alive. It clings to your skin like wet wool and carries the stench of sweat, urine, and boiled nettles. You're not sure if you're in a birthing room or the throat of a dragon. A woman is chanting over you. Another is gripping your thigh like she's afraid you'll escape. Spoiler, you won't. You're flat on your back, legs trembling, belly rock hard, and there's a sharp pain curling through your spine like a medieval snake made of knives. You're in labor. It's 1297 and you are entirely, terrifyingly alone. Surrounded by women, yes, but alone in your body, your fear, and the growing certainty that this might be how you die. The room is no bigger than a pantry. Its walls are made of damp wood, the floor is dirt, and the air is thick with the tang of iron. Blood, past and present. Above your head, someone's hung a small wooden cross. Not for comfort, for luck. The midwife, she's not a doctor, not a nurse, not anything you'd recognize, leans over you with a mouth stained red from wine. She spits it between your legs, not metaphorically, actually spits. It's part of a ritual meant to loosen the gate and bless the passage. You want to scream, but your mouth is dry and your voice is busy, trying not to break. She ties a charm around your neck, made from bone, ash, and a tiny scrap of a saint's cloak. Another woman rubs your temples with goose fat and murmurs something about Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth, escapee of a dragon's belly, and apparently your only hope. There is no anesthesia, no sterile instruments, no ultrasound, epidural, or encouraging playlist. What you have is a bed of straw, two women with herbal knowledge passed down like kitchen gossip, and a third silently preparing towels, which, by the way, are just rags boiled in nettle water and prayer. Pain hits again, not like a wave, or like a siege. It takes over your abdomen, crushes your ribs, and leaves you panting like a hunted animal. The midwife looks pleased. She says something about the child descending. You have no idea what that means, only that your spine might be cracking, your hips feel like they're being forced open with a blacksmith's tools, and the room smells more and more like blood. This is not a sacred moment. This is not glowing with maternal divinity. This is survival. Outside, someone starts chanting. A neighbor, maybe, or the local priest. Birth is risky, and death lurks just beyond the doorway, waiting to see who it will claim, you or the child, or both. The church says your pain is Eve's fault, a holy punishment. That if you die in childbirth, your soul might ascend. That's supposed to be comforting. You're not comforted. The midwife reaches into you. Her hands are rough, her nails stained. You want to run, you want to disappear, but you're just meat now. A body with a job. A door that must open. And the baby? You haven't seen it yet, haven't heard it. But its struggle is written on your own flesh. You are both trapped in the same dark tunnel, trying to make sense of ancient instincts and bad lighting. In the corner, a basin steams with herbs. Not to clean anything. That would be too modern. It's to mask the smell of blood, the stench of mortality. Maybe to fool death into thinking this is a kitchen, not a battlefield. Someone brings in a rosary. Someone else starts crying. And you? You clench your teeth, push against the pain, and wonder if anyone will remember your name. Or just the way you screamed when the head finally crowned. The pushing isn't noble, it's not beautiful, it's primal and humiliating. You groan, moan, sometimes howl. Not because it helps, but because silence would kill you faster. One of the women pours more wine into your mouth. It burns, not enough to numb the pain, just enough to make you forget which part of your body is splitting. Almost there, the midwife lies. Or maybe not. Truth is slippery here, tangled between pain and time. You could be minutes away. Or hours. You could be dying. You probably are. The door creaks open, a small thing, but it shakes you. A draft touches your ankles. For a moment, you're cold, then hot again, then somewhere in between, like your soul can't decide whether to flee or stay for the ending. Outside, someone has lit a fire. Not for warmth, but to keep evil spirits away. Smoke drifts in, you breathe it. You breathe everything, dirt, sweat, the sourness of fear. It becomes part of your lungs, your bloodstream, your child. The midwife whispers a prayer, not to God exactly, to Mary, the only woman who ever gave birth, pure, painless, and perfect. The impossible standard nailed above every medieval bed. You bear down again. A scream claws out of your throat. Something shifts inside you, a pop, a slide, a firework made of flesh and agony. There's pressure, then burning, then wet. The head has crowned. They see it, you feel it. There's no mirror, no gentle encouragement. Just a collective gasp and the sound of rags being soaked in fluid that's more blood than water. Someone says, "It's time." Time for what, you think? Time to live or time to die? One final push, one final scream, one final surrender to the force inside your own body. A force older than any prayer, wilder than any doctor. You are no longer woman, you are vessel. Volcano, violence. And then, release. A cry. Not yours. Small, wet, furious. The baby is out. They hold it up to the candlelight. Its skin is blue, its limbs limp. No one breathes. The midwife rubs its back, hard, like scrubbing a stain. She mutters something that sounds like a threat. Then suddenly, air. The baby gasps, then wails. The room exhales. You don't. You're still bleeding, still open, still broken, but you've survived. For now. The midwife bundles the baby, no weighing, no measuring, just swaddled in old linen and placed against your chest, like a warm, wriggling question. You don't know if it's a boy or a girl. No one asks. What matters is that it breathes, that you both still exist in the same cruel, miraculous world. In the distance, church bells toll. Another hour gone, another woman reborn, if she's lucky. And you lie there in your sweat, your blood, your fear, and your raw, rattled love. Welcome to motherhood, medieval style. It wasn't the germs that got you, not first, anyway. Before the fever, before the hemorrhage, before the smell of decay settled in like a guest with no intention of leaving, there was fear. A quiet terror that began the moment your belly started to swell. Not from the weight of a child, but from the knowledge that this thing growing inside you might end you. That your body, so celebrated for its fertility, could just as easily become your coffin. No one said it out loud. They didn't need to. You saw it in the eyes of older women, the ones with 4 children and haunted stares. You felt it in the silence of the midwife when she tied the red ribbon around your wrist for protection. You heard it in the stories whispered over bread and broth. She bled for 2 days. They buried her with the baby still inside. Even before your first contraction, you were already mourning yourself. Every ache was a question. Is this normal? Am I dying? Every cramp, every drop of blood, every kick. A riddle written in flesh and fear. And still you prepared. You sewed your own shroud. Just in case. You left small tokens by your bedside, a carved cross, a lock of your mother's hair, a rag doll for the baby, if it made it. You confessed your sins. You made peace with God. You didn't know if you'd see the morning. Fear in medieval birth wasn't an emotion. It was a condition. You carried it in your spine, in your jaw, in the stiffness of your fingers as you braided your hair, just in case your body was too swollen to be buried with dignity later. But the worst fear? Judgment? Because if the baby died, it was your fault. If it was born deformed, it was because you had impure thoughts. If it died before baptism, its soul would drift in limbo, and you were the door that closed too soon. If you screamed too loud, they said the devil had entered you. If you were too quiet, they feared you were already slipping into death. You couldn't win, so you prayed. Not for a boy or a girl. Not even for health. just for mercy. And yet mercy was rare. More common were the looks, the rumors, the sharp tongues of neighbors who said you ate the wrong herbs, or looked too proud during pregnancy, or sinned in your marriage bed. Women in labor were watched like criminals, judged for every sound, every breath, every failure, because childbirth wasn't just dangerous, it was moral. Your pain was a test of virtue. Your silence was a mark of holiness. Your death, a divine verdict. So you feared not just for your life, but for your soul. That fear tightened your muscles, slowed your labor, made every push harder. Panic strangled your breath. And in the darkness of that hut, fear became the true midwife, guiding every moment with cold, invisible hands. It's no wonder so many died. Medicine hadn't caught up. Clean water was a luxury. Instruments were reused, unwashed, often shared between animals and humans. But what truly killed most women wasn't infection alone. It was being too afraid to scream, too ashamed to ask for help, too convinced that suffering was holy. And when they did die, when their bodies gave out from fear and blood loss, they were often buried quietly, blamed gently, mourned politely. She must have sinned, some said. She didn't pray enough, said others. No one blamed the system. No one questioned the rituals. No one asked why God would design a birth canal that seemed more like a trap door. But you, lying there between life and death, you asked. You just couldn't say it out loud because fear had taken your voice too. The first person to judge your labor wasn't a midwife, it was God, or rather, his earthly representative, a priest, a bishop, a pious uncle with too many opinions and not enough womb. In medieval Europe, childbirth was not just biological, it was theological. Your pain had meaning, and not the comforting Oprah Winfrey kind. No, your pain was proof of sin, Eve's sin to be precise. She bit the apple, and now you get to scream. That was the deal. Genesis 3:16 wasn't just scripture, it was obstetrics. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, which meant that if you suffered, you were holy. And if you didn't, suspicious. So when your screams echoed through the village, they weren't met with sympathy, they were measured. Were you crying out in prayer? Or in rebellion? Was that agony pious enough? Because somewhere between your contractions, someone decided that your pain needed supervision. Enter the clergy. Sometimes they stood outside the birthing room, muttering Latin blessings through the cracks in the wall. Other times they came in, robes trailing, eyes averted, supposedly, clutching relics like garlic against the devil. They sprinkled holy water on the sheets. They held crucifixes over your swollen belly, and if you died before the baby came out, they tried to baptize the womb, yes, literally, with water, whispered prayers and a stick, because a baby who died unbaptized couldn't go to heaven. It went to limbo, a spiritual waiting room filled with the innocent but doomed. No pressure, though. And if the baby was born deformed, with a clubfoot, a missing hand, or too many toes, some believed it wasn't a baby at all. It was a changeling, a demon in disguise, a punishment for your vanity, your laziness, your impure dreams. Maybe you danced too close to the fire during a feast day. Maybe you skipped confession. Maybe, just maybe, you were a witch. The church had questions. Always. About your modesty, about your silence, about your soul. And if your midwife used herbs to ease your pain, be careful. Some priests considered that sorcery. Even peppermint tea could be unnatural. Pain, after all, was sacred. If you avoided it, you avoided your duty to suffer. Imagine lying in labor, body breaking open, and someone whispering, "Have faith, and don't cry too loud, or we'll have to fetch the bishop." It wasn't rare. In some regions, parturient women were forbidden from entering churches for 40 days post-delivery. They were unclean, as if life itself made them temporarily cursed. They needed to be churched, blessed and reintegrated, because nothing says, "Congratulations on your new baby," like a formal ritual to make you spiritually acceptable again. And what about the baby? Before it was even dry, someone had to make sure it got baptized immediately, especially if it looked weak. Midwives were often granted temporary permission to perform emergency baptisms. One hand on the child, one eye on eternity, because if it died before the ritual, its soul would wander. And that, not your hemorrhaging, not your fever, not your ruptured uterus, that was the real tragedy. This was the church in your bedroom, not as comfort, as judge, as witness, as a reminder that your womb wasn't really yours, it belonged to God. And God was always watching, even when you screamed, especially when you screamed. She arrives before the bleeding starts, before the water breaks, before the child crowns, before the priest knocks and the neighbors gather and the pain becomes your God. She's already there, the midwife, wrapped in layers of wool that smell like ash, herbs, and old secrets. Her hands are cracked. Her breath is thick with garlic and vinegar. Her eyes have seen things no saint ever wrote about. She knows where life begins and how often it ends. She is your only hope and your potential downfall, because to the village she is half angel, half threat. A walking contradiction with a pouch full of dried plants, a heart full of knowledge, and a reputation that dances dangerously close to the fire. Midwives in the Middle Ages were not licensed. They weren't formally trained. Their education came from experience, which meant death taught them everything they knew. For every baby they helped into the world, there were 3 they couldn't save. For every mother who kissed her newborn, another bled out with her prayers still caught in her throat. And still, they were called, because no one else would come. Doctors, expensive, rare, often male, and frankly terrified of anything below the waist unless it belonged to a corpse. The church, concerned with the soul, not the cervix. Neighbors, full of fear, not skill. So it was the midwife. She boiled the cloth, tied the charms, knew the timing of contractions like other people knew the seasons. She whispered to the belly, she sang to the blood, she caught babies with hands that trembled only after it was over. But power makes people nervous, and a woman who could control pain, who knew how to stop a hemorrhage with a tincture of mugwort and desperation, who muttered words not found in church books. She was dangerous, sometimes honored, sometimes hanged. The line between healer and heretic was thinner than the membrane around a newborn's head, and midwives walked it barefoot. Some were accused of witchcraft, too many herbs, too much confidence, too many miracles. If a baby died, it was her fault. If it lived but was weak, still her fault. If the mother didn't scream loud enough, suspicion. If she screamed too loud, possession. Midwives were blamed for stillbirths, cursed milk, sudden deaths. They were said to steal babies for rituals, boil bones for potions, make love potions from placenta. The same hands that cradled your child might one day be tied behind her back and burned for knowing too much. And yet, they kept coming. When your belly stretched, when your waters broke, when your body split and your soul hovered nearby, undecided, the midwife was there. Kneeling in the dirt, elbow deep in blood, not because she was fearless, but because someone had to be. Your body is not yours. It's a battlefield, a punishment, a theological problem wrapped in flesh. In the Middle Ages, the womb wasn't just misunderstood, it was feared, it was unstable, unpredictable, leaky. A kind of divine joke played on half the population. Something that could bleed without dying, stretch without snapping, and grow life like mold on bread. The church didn't know what to do with it, so it blamed it. Theologians, men of course, wrote treatises about your moist nature, your cold temperament, your wandering womb, which according to some could roam around your body like a mouse in a cathedral, causing hysteria, madness, and spiritual corruption. You weren't a woman, you were a potential disaster. And childbirth, that was the moment your punishment bloomed, because Eve disobeyed. She reached, she bit, she knew, and now every time you scream through a contraction, you're paying that cosmic debt, in pain, in blood, in silence, if you're holy enough. Thou shalt bring forth children in sorrow. Not a metaphor, a medical directive. The more it hurt, the more righteous you must be. Even your period was suspect. Church fathers debated whether menstrual blood was poison, whether it could wilt crops, rust mirrors, sicken infants. Some said it attracted demons. Others claimed it was the devil's ink, the signature on your original sin. So when you got pregnant, it wasn't just biology, it was theology, a test. And if you miscarried, clearly a moral failure, proof that you hadn't prayed enough, or that your husband had impure thoughts, or that God had changed his mind. The womb was a spiritual wild card. It could create saints or monsters, angels or changelings. And you, bleeding, swollen, terrified, were expected to trust that this sacred chaos was somehow your purpose. There were no ultrasounds, no explanations, just a terrifying silence between each movement in your belly. Was it healthy? Was it human? Was it God's will? Or the devil's prank? You wouldn't know until the screaming stopped. And by then, it might be too late. The smell hits first. Not the sharp, clean metallic tang you might imagine, but something heavier, thicker, like warm pennies soaked in stagnant water and buried under old straw. Blood, yes. But not alone. It's joined by sweat, feces, smoke, bile, and the quiet stink of fear. That sour, skin-deep scent that clings when you know you might not survive the next hour. This is a birthing room in the Middle Ages, not a hospital, not even a room, really. A corner, a cot, a patch of dirt by the fire. There are no linens, no monitors, no antiseptics, only rags. Old ones, stiff from previous labours and washed in river water, shared with animals. If you're lucky, someone remembered to boil them.
If not, well, there's no such thing as sterile. The midwife's hands, competent, calloused, wholly in their way, are also contaminated. She's been up for 36 hours. She's delivered 2 babies, buried one, and milked a goat before coming to you. She doesn't wash, she wipes. That's enough. You don't care. You're past caring. You're shivering now, even though it's warm. That's not a good sign.
Neither is the taste of copper in your mouth, or the way your vision pulses like a candle on its last gasp. You've been bleeding for too long, too fast. You can feel the life draining, not like a metaphor, but like soup slipping from a cracked bowl. They try things, old things, a poultice of burnt feathers and crushed nettle pressed against your groin, a candle placed under your foot, meant to draw the blood downward, whispered prayers, screamed Latin, a relic of St. Catherine shoved under your tongue. You don't feel better, you feel nothing. The world narrows, the firelight flickers into fog. You hear a baby crying. Yours? Someone else's? You can't tell. Everything is distant now, like it's happening in another body, in another life. Someone calls your name. You don't answer. You're busy floating, somewhere above the room, watching as your body trembles, your skin pales, your blood paints the floor like a failed miracle. This is how death comes, not like a sword, like a stain. In medieval Europe, postpartum hemorrhage was a death sentence whispered through generations, a silent killer that needed no weapon, no malice, just time, and no one could stop it. No doctor could repair a torn uterus. No surgeon could replace the pints of blood you lost. No antiseptic to clean the wounds. No antibiotics to fight the infection already creeping into your bones. They didn't even call it sepsis. They called it childbed fever. And it was as common as rain. It started with a chill, then the fever, then the swelling, then the smell. By the time the midwife noticed, it was too late. Your body would balloon, your belly harden, your breath quicken into panicked gasps. And the only thing anyone could do was pray. Hard. Sometimes they bled you, that's right. Bled a bleeding woman, because imbalance of humours, they said. Too much blood, too much heat. A few more ounces lost might restore equilibrium. It never worked, but they tried. They always tried. When you finally went still, someone would close your eyes, cross your arms, cover your face. The baby, if alive, would be taken to suckle from another woman already nursing her own. If not, a double burial, a coffin shared. You'd be remembered as devout, as taken too soon, but rarely as a martyr of medicine, rarely as a victim of ignorance, because death in childbirth wasn't tragic. It was expected. Women feared it like a storm they couldn't outrun. They prepared for it. Wrote farewell letters, hid keepsakes for their children, sewed crosses into their nightgowns so that, even if they died screaming, they'd die dressed for heaven. There were no headstones for most of them. Just dirt, just stories, and the memory of a smell that lingered long after the fire burned out. So when you light a candle tonight, when you crawl into your clean bed with a glass of water and a locked door, and no one expecting you to give birth or die quietly, remember this. You don't carry that smell. You carry their survival. Privacy? Forget it. In the medieval world, giving birth was less of a sacred moment and more of a neighborhood event. The kind with smoke, noise, ritual, and at least one person crying in the corner. And that person was probably you. Your labor doesn't unfold in silence or solitude. It explodes in a small, smoky room crammed with bodies, smells, and unsolicited opinions. The midwife is there, of course, barking instructions and chewing on something herbal. But so are your neighbors, and your sister-in-law, and the woman who once accused you of stealing her goat, but has somehow become emotionally invested in your cervix. Because birth, in the Middle Ages, was communal, not in the comforting village it takes way. In the you're naked and screaming while someone gossips about your hips way. Modesty dies first. You're on your back, or on your knees, or squatting over a bucket. Doesn't matter, your body is no longer yours. It's a site of public interest. Women hover around you, team to help, yes, but also to watch, to see if your labor is righteous or shameful, if your cries are holy or hysterical, if the child comes quickly or not at all. Sometimes they sing, not lullabies, prayers, chants, pleas to saints who probably didn't ask to be summoned to a stranger's perineum. Incense is burned, doors are sealed, crosses are drawn in ash over the windows to keep out spirits, or to keep them in. The midwife soaks rags in oil, others bring hot stones to warm your feet, believing it encourages the womb to open. Someone throws sage on the fire, the smoke thickens, the room spins, and still, no baby. You scream, you bite, you plead, and the crowd leans in, even the children peek. Yes, sometimes children are allowed in, to learn, to help, to hold bowls of blood or water or bile, to witness the mystery of life, or the horror of it, or both. Meanwhile, your husband is outside, not pacing, not holding your hand, praying, because men aren't allowed inside the birthing room. It's a female domain, sacred, chaotic, dangerous. He waits with the other men, silent, pale, holding a candle and the name he's picked out. If you die, he'll marry again, probably within the year, maybe sooner if there's a wet nurse available. You don't think about that. You think about breathing, or trying to. The room smells like flesh, blood, garlic, wood smoke, old wool, someone's breath, everything, nothing. You're dizzy, you're sobbing, and a neighbor you barely know is telling you to push with more grace. You want to slap her, but you can't feel your arms. The child finally crowns. There's shouting, applause, maybe even laughter. Someone praises St. Margaret, someone else pours more wine. For you? No, for themselves. Your labor was a show and it's over. Unless you keep bleeding, then it becomes a funeral. But if you survive, and the child survives, they wrap you both in cloth and begin another ritual, the lying in. 40 days of bed rest and purification, not to heal, to become clean again, spiritually, socially. Until then, you're impure, untouchable. You don't enter churches, you don't handle food for guests, you don't speak to the priest, you're not quite alive yet. But the neighborhood remembers. They recount your labor like it was theater. She screamed like a banshee. The baby nearly fell out. The midwife slapped her thigh, I swear. Every groan becomes folklore, every tear a punchline. And you? You just lie there, holding a life, relearning your own. The year was 1348. The air stank of death and wood smoke. The fields were quiet. The church bells rang not for prayer, but for the dead, one after another, in slow, endless rhythm. She was a peasant. We don't know her name. No one wrote it down. But she lived, briefly, in the margins of a parchment, in the half-legible scrawl of a local monk chronicling the year the world broke. The Black Death had reached her village. People died in hours, neighbors vanished. Whole families locked themselves inside and never opened their doors again. And she was pregnant. 9 months, alone, abandoned by her kin, not from cruelty, but from plague. Her husband had been buried last week. Or was it yesterday? Her sister had fled, her midwife, dead or hiding. When the labor began, there was no one to hold her hand, no one to boil the water, no one to tell her to breathe or push or pray. She was alone. The house was barely a shelter, a wooden structure half collapsed, the thatched roof blackened with rot. The floor was dirt, the straw was wet. Her belly tightened, her back cracked, and she screamed into a silence that didn't care. She gave birth on her knees, no fire, no candle, just darkness and instinct. The baby slid out like a secret, silent, small, still. She held it. For a long time. The monk wrote that she wrapped the child in her skirt and laid it on her chest, though it did not cry. He didn't say boy or girl. He didn't say whether it had hair, or if it looked like its father, or if its eyes had ever opened. He just wrote, it did not cry. She waited. Hours, maybe longer, till the cold crept in. And then she dug. With her hands, her nails, her bare, bleeding fingers. The ground was frozen in places. She tore through it anyway, a hole, not deep, but enough. She laid the child inside. No priest, no baptism, no name. She covered the tiny body with soil and moss, muttered something that might have been prayer, and collapsed beside the grave. When they found her days later, gaunt, feverish, delirious, she was still there. The monk wrote, she was taken to the chapel where she wept without sound and would not eat. They let her stay. She slept on the floor near the altar. Sometimes she screamed at night. Sometimes she just stared. One nun tried to give her a wooden cross to hold. She pressed it to her chest, then whispered. It was small, like a loaf of bread. I held it. That's all she ever said about the child. She died a few weeks later, not of plague, not of bleeding, of starvation, of silence, of something too invisible to diagnose but easy to name, grief. There are thousands of stories like hers, most never written, most never remembered. But this one survived, barely. A note in the margin, a monk's pen hesitating before the next obituary. She didn't save the baby, she didn't save herself, but she buried her child with her own hands. And in a world that had stopped burying its dead, that was an act of impossible love. No sainthood, no monument, just a patch of earth and a sentence in Latin. Oblita sed non vana, forgotten but not meaningless. In the Middle Ages, science and superstition walked hand in hand, usually in circles, and nowhere was this more obvious than in medieval obstetrics, where the dominant medical opinion was, wait for it, The baby decides. That's right. According to physicians, scholars, and even a few monks with too much time and access to Aristotle, the baby was the boss. The fetus was thought to be active, not passive, a miniature philosopher king who chose the perfect moment to emerge based on the alignment of stars, the purity of the mother's soul, and perhaps whether or not it felt like it. The womb, not a biological chamber, a house, a classroom, a divine waiting room. And the baby? A tiny theologian contemplating the mysteries of the flesh before descending into the world. If labor stalled, it wasn't because of contractions or positioning. It was because the baby was unwilling, unready, or worse, resisting. A difficult birth was often blamed on the child. It refused to turn. It remained stubborn. It hid its face from the world. In other words, your baby might be disobedient before it even breathed. No one asked what this said about your uterus. But here's the medieval twist. When the baby didn't choose to be born fast enough, they intervened. And by intervened, we mean they reached in, literally, sometimes with bare hands, sometimes with hooks, sometimes with a device called a vaginal speculum that looked more like an instrument of war than medicine. There were no gloves, no antiseptic, no anesthesia, just conviction. Conviction that this child was late on purpose and it had to be removed. Tools were inserted to encourage descent, pulleys, hooks, even bladed instruments to relieve pressure. Some were designed to crush the skull of a baby already presumed dead, not out of cruelty, but because saving the mother, in theory, took precedence. But that wasn't always how it went. Sometimes the mother was too young, or too poor, or already bleeding. Sometimes she had sinned, or was suspected of sinning, or simply lacked the right family name. And then, well, God's will. Medical textbooks described the fetus in strange ways, as a hot creature, formed in slime, nurtured by menstrual blood. It was believed to float in the womb like a fish in a sacred pond, feeding off maternal vapors and deciding, at a moment of divine impulse, to be born. The idea of a due date? Non-existent. There were no calendars pinned to kitchen walls, no sonograms, no baby is the size of a pear updates. There were signs, dreams, stomach shape, moon phases, a sudden craving for vinegar, a bird flying east, a neighbor's cow refusing to milk. Labor could begin any time, and no one knew what to expect, except pain and possibly death. A woman might push for 2 days, 3, with no progress, her body exhausted, her soul unraveling, and the midwife, desperate, would whisper, "It has not chosen." If the baby died inside her, they called it punishment, or proof of failure, or evidence that the child was never meant for this world, that it had judged the mother and found her unworthy. The grief that followed wasn't spoken, it was folded, buried, hidden beneath layers of linen and liturgy, because if your child never cried, maybe it never counted. And so women hoped that the baby would turn, that it would decide, that it would look kindly on this world of blood and rot and prayers mumbled through clenched teeth, and choose to arrive. And when it did, when it cried, it wasn't just a birth. It was forgiveness. You survived. Your baby is alive. And yet, you're still not considered clean. In medieval Europe, birth didn't end with a cry. It ended with a ritual, or several, because even if you made it through the valley of blood and fire, your body was now suspect, spiritually polluted, physically unstable, dangerous even. You were leaking, and nothing terrified the medieval world more than a woman who leaked. Postpartum bleeding, with what we'd now call lochia, was seen as both natural and shameful, the remnants of your impurity, your inner rot, your sin being expelled, which meant that for the next 40 days you were in a kind of limbo, neither sick nor well, neither sacred nor profane. You were unclean. The church had rules. Of course it did. After giving birth, you were barred from entering holy spaces. No mass, no communion, no blessings. You couldn't touch sacred objects. In some villages, even food prepared by postpartum women was avoided for fear that their impurity might poison the soul or the soup. Instead, you were expected to lie in a period of confinement, rest, social exile. But rest is a generous word. Your body was wrecked, torn, swollen, stitched if someone knew how. You bled onto straw and linen rags, reused and never quite clean. Your breasts ached, leaked, cracked. If the baby nursed, you winced. If it didn't, you panicked. There were no lactation consultants, no pads, no painkillers. You endured. Midwives checked your belly to see if it shrunk correctly. They burned herbs not to soothe you, but to mask the smell of sweat, milk, blood, and whatever infection might be brewing beneath the surface. They watched your eyes, your speech, your appetite, because postpartum illness wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. If you wept too much, refused to eat, seemed distant from your baby, it could be a sign of melancholia, puerperalis, or worse, demonic possession. Yes, postpartum depression was real. But medieval Europe didn't have the language, just the fear. So women were isolated. Their blood made them untouchable, their minds suspect, their souls in recovery. At the end of 40 days, assuming no complications, came the churching ceremony. You would dress modestly, often in black, a candle in hand, head bowed. You'd kneel before the priest, who would bless you with holy water and welcome you back into the sacred fold. Congratulations, you're pure again, or close enough. No one talked about the ones who didn't make it to churching, the ones who bled too long, who shivered with fever, who wandered barefoot into the woods one night and were found days later silent and stiff. They were buried quickly, often without sacrament. Childbed death, they said. God's will. Superstition filled the gaps where medicine failed. Some women hung iron scissors above the bed to ward off witches. Others pinned wolf teeth inside their gowns. A few anointed their breasts with holy oil to protect the baby while nursing. And salt, always salt, placed in the baby's cradle to keep evil spirits from stealing the soul. Because not even survival was safe. The devil was always nearby, especially when life had just arrived. And you? You lay there, day after day, wondering if the bleeding would stop, if the pain in your side meant healing or death, if your baby would nurse or gasp or go quiet, if you'd ever be touched again, not in lust, but in kindness. You were exhausted, terrified, and holy in a way the world would never admit. But eventually, the bleeding slowed. You stood, you walked, you entered the church, blinking against the light, and for the first time since your body broke open to let the future out, you were allowed to be seen again. You'd think money could save you. It couldn't. Not from childbirth, not in the Middle Ages, not even wrapped in silk and surrounded by candlelight. If you were noble, wealthy, high-born, yes, you had more pillows, more help, more prayers said on your behalf. But under the layers of brocade and velvet, your uterus still obeyed the same brutal rules. And it could still kill you. The birthing room of a noblewoman was, on the surface, luxurious. Thick tapestries hung on the walls to muffle screams and block out draughts, carved beds with high headboards, cushions embroidered with saints and flowers. There were even perfumed cloths, dipped in rosewater or lavender, to mask the smell of sweat and blood. But beneath the fragrance, the same danger. Doctors might be summoned, yes, learned men trained in the universities of Paris or Salerno, but these men rarely touched the patient. Touching was for midwives. Still summoned, still central. The doctor would stand at a distance, stroke his beard, and consult a book written a century ago. He might suggest bleeding. He might measure your pulse by placing a finger on your wrist and counting while reciting the Lord's Prayer. He might taste your urine, but if you screamed, if you tore, if the baby came wrong, that was God's decision.
And the midwife's problem. Wealth gave you cushions, not certainty. And the fear, it was worse. Because noble women were political vessels. Your baby wasn't just a child, it was a legacy, a treaty, an heir. Your survival was important, sure, but not essential. The child mattered more, especially if it was male. So the pressure was suffocating, not just to live, but to produce the right kind of life.
There were expectations, rituals. If the birth went poorly, rumors spread fast. Whispers about your health, your virtue, your womb. If you failed to deliver, your husband might take another wife, or a mistress, or a priest's blessing to try again with someone else. And the baby? It was swept away quickly, cleaned, presented, sometimes baptized before you'd even held it, in case it died within the hour. You might not see it again for days. You, meanwhile, were expected to endure, nobly, quietly, elegantly. The ideal noble birth was an illusion, serene, silent, spiritually rich. But behind the curtains, it was often chaos. Blood on the stone floor, screams muffled by silk, servants running for help, for towels, for more wine. Wine was medicine, for the pain, for the doctor, for everyone. If you died, your body was wrapped in fine cloth and placed in the chapel. A priest would say your name. The baby, if alive, would be lifted high, as if to say, "Look, she did her duty." If you lived, you were confined. 40 days like everyone else. But your chamber was softer, your meals better, your linens cleaner. Your isolation, though, just as deep. You bled the same blood. You feared the same silence. And in the dark, when the candles flickered and the castle echoed with cold, you whispered the same prayer as the poorest peasant. Let me live. We shouldn't be here. Statistically, spiritually, anatomically. We shouldn't. For centuries, childbirth was closer to execution than celebration, a coin toss of blood and breath. And yet, somehow, here we are, descendants of women who screamed through the night and lived to tell no one, because most of them didn't write. They bled, they pushed, they prayed. And then they vanished into the soil, remembered by no one but the children they managed to leave behind. Your great-great-great-grandmother. She didn't have a birth plan. She had a corner of a hut, a midwife who might be burned for helping her, and a charm tied around her neck, made of saint bone and superstition. She was one bad turn, one torn vessel, one unlucky fever away from being buried in the same sheet she labored on. And yet she made it. So did her daughter, and now you. You who sleep in a bed that lifts with buttons. Who can time contractions with a glowing screen? Who can choose when or if to have a child? Who will never have to taste holy wine from a midwife's mouth or hide your bleeding from a priest? But your body remembers, not in science, in story. In some deep, cellular way, you carry the memory of that dirt floor, that straw, that moment when someone whispered, "It's time," and you didn't know if they meant for life or death. You are the ending of a prayer whispered by someone who couldn't read, a miracle made mundane by modernity. And maybe that's the real gift. Not that we live without pain, but that we can name it, treat it, share it, that we can tell the stories they were never allowed to write, the stories of birth as blood, as faith, as defiance, because every one of us is here because someone didn't die, someone bled and screamed and tore and still kept going, someone survived a room with no soap, a prayer that didn't work, a midwife who tried her best and failed, and somehow, in the dirt and fire and rot of it all, we endured. So the next time the world feels heavy or the night stretches long or you wonder what you're made of, remember this. You come from women who survived the impossible with nothing but pain and prayer and a spine made of quiet steel. And still, they laughed. They sang lullabies. They loved their babies. They lived. And now, so do you.